The deceased isn't coming back, so the spa trip takes priority. It was indeed a sudden passing, so I felt bad about canceling the hotel we had booked. But I couldn't believe she wouldn't attend her father-in-law's funeral or change her travel plans. I'll visit the grave later. See you. Susan got ready by herself and left for the trip alone. After everything was over and I was completely drained, I arrived home and started changing my clothes. As I was about to take off my jacket, Susan returned from her trip. I'm home. The spa hotel were amazing. Swallowing various emotions, I told Susan. I just got back from your parents' funeral. Huh? My name is Mark. I'm 42 and work in an office at a medical equipment manufacturer. From an outsider's perspective, my life might seem dull, but it's quite fulfilling because I spend a lot of time and money on my hobby. My hobby is traveling. I've always loved spontaneously going on solo trips whenever I had time off. I've traveled all over the US, never getting tired of it. The thawing springs of Alaska, the lush green summers in Oregon, the beautiful autumn leaves in New England, enjoying hot springs while watching the snow in Colorado. I frequent my favorite tourist spots and have become a familiar face at many hotels. Acting alone has become a habit for me, and being with others tires me out. That's why, despite having worked at the same company for many years since graduating, I remained single. But at 40, a turning point came. While enjoying a leisurely solo trip to Charleston, I met Susan. We stayed at the same hotel and, like me, she was well acquainted with the landlady. In the lobby, with its beautifully manicured garden view, we happened to be looking at the same autumn leaves. A red dragonfly flew in front of me, and I instinctively raised my finger. When it landed on my finger, Susan looked over and smiled. I returned the smile and said hi. It's a beautiful view, isn't it? Every fall, I feel like staying in this hotel. Me too. So, we must have crossed paths before without realizing it. We hit it off while talking. I vividly remembered Susan smiling against a backdrop of the beautiful garden. Susan attended a university in the city, but after graduating, she returned to her hometown in Montana. She worked in a real estate office there. She was outgoing, and I felt relaxed talking to her, unusual for someone I had just met. For someone like me, who had spent a lot of time alone, not having to be on guard was important. We exchanged contact information and, after the trip, kept in touch for calls and video chats, deepening our friendship. Meeting Susan made me seriously consider marriage for the first time. She was 33 at the time. Like me, she quickly became serious about marriage after meeting me. That year's end, I proposed to Susan. She agreed but had one condition. I'm not young anymore, and if you want kids, things might get rushed. I'm fine if it happens naturally, but I don't want to undergo fertility treatments. I wasn't particularly fond of children and understood that tool fertility treatments could take on a woman. So we decided not to stress over having kids and instead enjoy our hobby of traveling. At our wedding, Susan's parents and sister, Linda, from Montana, congratulated us. Mark, please take good care of Susan. We were worried she'd never settle down because of all her travels, but now we can finally relax. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, I may not be much, but I promise to work hard and make Susan happy. And so, Susan and I started our married life together in the city. For our honeymoon, Susan and I, who both love domestic travel, chose Hawaii. We relaxed there for about 2 weeks before returning to the city life and starting our married life. Since then, every 3 months, I took time off work so we could enjoy the diverse landscapes of the US. I think those were the most peaceful and happy days of my life. I won't say I've always lived alone, but most of the time, I made decisions and acted on my own. However, now everything was a duo act, and I started consulting before making any decisions. Life became more relaxed and enjoyable for me every day. But what about Susan? For about a year after our marriage, Susan was a homemaker, but gradually she expressed a desire to work outside. We could manage on my salary alone if we didn't splurge, but it seemed Susan wasn't completely satisfied. One evening after I returned from work, Susan had a suggestion. "There's a boutique nearby looking for a part-time clerk. I went for an interview, and they said I could start tomorrow." I was somewhat unsettled that she had gone for an interview without discussing it with me first. But it seemed like staying at home all day was almost painful for Susan, who had always been working. "Sure, we can get by on just your salary, but I want my own spending money. Everyone in the city is so stylish, and I feel so dowdy in comparison." I never thought of Susan as dowdy, having lived in the city myself. "Aren't you overthinking it, Tommy? You fit in perfectly with the city life." "That's sweet of you to say, but you're biased. I want to own designer bags and buy high-end skincare products for aging care, you know. That's okay, right?" I was really torn. Designer bags and expensive cosmetics seemed like a waste to me. But that's probably because I'm a man not interested in fashion. "All right, just don't neglect the housework, okay? Coming home tired from work to a living room full of laundry is the last thing I want." Susan pouted. "I've realized since getting married, you're quite the domineering husband, Mark. That's not in vogue anymore, but I'll try my best to avoid that situation." And so, Susan started working part-time. The boutique she worked at was in a prime location, on the second floor of a building near the station. The store was lined with high-end brands carefully selected by the manager, Kevin. I was pretty worried. Surrounded by all these dazzling brands, could Susan resist the temptation to buy? Her earnings might end up being spent on these high-end brands, leaving little to save. But that was her wish, so I resigned myself to it. What I feared most was Susan's change. And as I feared, Susan did change. Once she started working, she became more flamboyant. How much she earned in a month? She wouldn't tell me. Our bedroom started overflowing with her dream high-end brand bags and luxury cosmetics. But such changes weren't a major issue. Eventually, Susan began to dislike traveling with me. Even if I took leave, she'd tell me to go on trips alone because of her work. And when she did find time to travel, it was always when I was busy at work. Her travel companion was often a colleague from her part-time job, Ashley. Traveling is about enjoying the extraordinary. It's better to deepen friendships by traveling with friends rather than with a husband I see every day. Ashley was 36. A woman enjoying her single life. According to Susan, Ashley spent most of her earnings on high-end brands and had no savings. Susan said she was showing her the joys of travel. Ashley has a shopping addiction, but I'm teaching her that money should be spent on experiences, not just things, for travel. I only talked to Ashley once and got the impression that she lived a rather ephemeral life. She didn't talk much and seemed to have few friends. Becoming friends with such a woman and teaching her about a world she doesn't know might be a bit like volunteering, I guess. Half a year later, Susan had plans to go on a spa trip with Ashley. Susan was supposed to leave around noon, but she was slow to get up. I finished preparing for work and went outside with a bag of burnable trash. A neighborhood housewife, Emily, was already there and noticed me. "Hi, Mark," she greeted. After some small talk, Emily began to share an astonishing piece of gossip. "Susan sure loves to travel, but you should keep a closer eye on her." I didn't understand and asked her what she meant. "What do you mean? It's true we haven't traveled together much lately." Then Emily lowered her voice and revealed a shocking story. "Actually, I saw Susan traveling with her boss when I was on a spa trip with my friends. Come to think of it, whenever Susan went on a trip lately, Her boutique also happened to be closed. I had thought it was because both clerks were off, but I never imagined she could be having an affair. A surge of anger began to well up inside me. I needed to find out the truth. I moved away from the trash collection area and called in sick to work. I was in no mood to work. After the call, I returned home, and the house phone was ringing. "Susan, how long is she going to sleep?" I hurried inside and picked up the receiver. It was my mother, sobbing. Your father. He suddenly collapsed and was taken to the hospital, but it was too late. I felt as if I'd been hit on the head. According to my mother, my father had collapsed on his way to the bathroom early in the morning. Unfortunately, she was still asleep and only found my father collapsed in the hallway when she got up. The delay in finding him was why he passed away at the hospital. If only I had noticed sooner. "Mark, please come home right away." Of course, I just happened to take the day off, so I'll get ready and come with Susan. "What about Tom?" He said he'd come right away. My brother Tom and his wife live a little bit far away from the home of my parents, so he'd probably arrive before me. I needed to hurry. I wanted to comfort my mother, who was shocked by my father's death. I hung up and went to wake Susan. My mind was in turmoil with the sudden news, and I wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. Should I confront Susan about the affair now? Pretending not to know and going home with her might comfort my mother. For my father, who had passed to heaven, I decided not to confront Susan about the affair immediately. When I opened the door to wake Susan, she was already up, packing for her trip. "Susan, listen, my father has passed away. My mother just told me over the phone. I'll get ready now, so let's go home together and attend a funeral." But Susan's response was unbelievable. "Why should I go? I'm not going." "Why wouldn't you? He was your father-in-law. How can you not say goodbye for the last time?" Susan sighed heavily, looking utterly fed up. "Oh, I hate this. This kind of family obligation is such a hassle. The deceased isn't coming back, so the hot spring trip takes priority. Indeed, if she were to attend the funeral, the hotel reservation would need to be canceled." But I couldn't believe she wouldn't attend her father-in-law's funeral or change her travel plans. "I'll visit the grave later. Okay, I'm leaving now." Susan just got ready by herself and left for the hot springs trip. At that moment, I felt like I truly saw Susan's true nature. I let her go without confronting her about the suspicion of infidelity. Everything was becoming too much of a hassle. I decided to forget that Susan was my wife and rushed to be with my mother. I packed a few days' worth of clothes into a small Boston bag. About 2 hours after Susan left, I was about to leave when the house phone rang. Wondering who it could be, I answered the phone, and it was from Susan's sister, Linda. "Mark, something terrible has happened. My parents got a car accident and taken to the hospital, but I can't get in touch with Susan." I was stunned by one terrible event after another. "Susan just left for a trip. How are your parents?" Linda's voice quivered with tears over the phone. "It's bad. They were in a head-on collision with another car. I'm so confused. Mark, can you come here as soon as possible?" Linda's husband had passed away 5 years ago. Now, she was the only one at her family home, feeling lost about what to do. "Linda, actually, my father passed away 2 hours ago, and I was just packing to go to my mother's." Linda gasped over the phone. "What a tragedy. Your father too." I'll try calling Susan again. I'll keep trying to reach her too. For now, I'm going to take a taxi to my parents' home. My brother is there, so he can handle the funeral arrangements. I'll head to your place as soon as it's over. My condolences. What a day this is. So much misfortune all at once. As Linda said, it felt almost cursed to have so much misfortune hit at once. It took about 2 hours by taxi to reach my parents' home. Tom and his wife had already arrived and looked relieved to see me. "Mark, glad you could make it. Mom has been in shock since she found out." "Oh, isn't Susan with you?" Well, I mumbled, not knowing what to say, and then went to the room where my mother was. "Mom, we're here for you. Leave the funeral arrangements to us brothers." My parents had a close relationship, so my mother's shock was immense. She stayed by my father's side, mourning his passing. My sister-in-law complained about Susan not being there. After all, it was an old-fashioned family funeral, and female help was needed. I tried to prevent Susan's reputation from getting any worse. "Linda, sorry for the trouble. Susan's parents also passed away, so as soon as the funeral is over, I'll head to Montana. Susan must be having a hard time too. I wish she could have come here, but under the circumstances, I understand." Tom and his wife thought Susan was in Montana for her parents' funeral. I didn't elaborate, and after saying farewell to my father at the funeral, took a train in my funeral attire. Linda looked exhausted. "Mark, what's Susan doing? Her own parents have died, and where is she?" We kept calling her cell phone, but it was turned off. "I have a lot I want to say to Susan too, but for now, let's quietly say goodbye to your parents." So we managed to hold the funeral amidst the sudden chaos. When I called my office to say I'd be back the following week, I received a lot of sympathy. My boss said I could take more time off for bereavement, but I couldn't indulge in that. After everything was over, I returned home on Monday morning, utterly exhausted, and started changing my clothes. I entered the bedroom to take off my jacket when I heard the front door open. Susan was back. "I'm home. The spa trip was fantastic." As I entered the living room, there was Susan, lying exhausted on the sofa. Seeing my face, she gave a slightly apologetic smile. "Did your father's funeral go smoothly?" I was appalled by Susan's words, but swallowed various emotions and told her. "I just got back from your parents' funeral." "What? Your father and mother passed away? It happened just 2 hours after you left home. Linda tried calling you, but your phone was off. I couldn't reach you either." Susan frantically took out her cell phone from her bag and turned it on. It was pointless now, and I was just astounded by her actions. I wanted to enjoy the escapism of the trip, but it can't be true that my dad and mom passed away. You must be angry and playing a cruel joke. If you think it's a lie, call Linda. Susan hurriedly called Linda. I could faintly hear Linda's reproachful voice from the cell phone. Watching Susan's panicked apologies, I realized how completely my feelings for her had cooled. In the train, I had been indecisive, but now I was resolved. "You must have enjoyed your affair trip. I came back today to pack my things. I don't think I'll be returning." I went back to the bedroom, packed a couple of shirts and suits in a trunk, and called a taxi to head to my parents' house. Susan kept calling persistently from her phone. I thought of turning it off like she did during her trip, but I still had things to say, so I answered. "I'm sorry for leaving the house unattended. Let me come to your family's home now to pay my respects." I replied with a feeling of detachment. "No need for insincere condolences. If you have time for that, be with your father and mother. They won't answer you anymore, though." Susan was in a panic. "Why is this happening? I go on trips all the time, but why did this have to happen now? Maybe it's karma, a heavy price to pay, I think, but at least to me, you're now a stranger. Have a good time with the store manager." With that, I turned off my phone. My return was a relief to my mother, who was feeling lonely after losing her husband. Tom, being transferred frequently, so there were circumstances preventing him from staying with our mother. If I stay at the family home, everything will work out smoothly. "Good to have you back. It's hard being alone in such a big house." "Don't worry, Mom. I'll commute to work from here. I can't replace Dad, but I won't let you feel insecure anymore." My mother tearfully expressed her gratitude. I'm glad I had sons. In times of sudden misfortune like this, you really are dependable. It's because you and Dad raised us with love. I wish I could have been more filial to Dad. Now, I'll do my best to help you. Losing my father made me realize his greatness. Not having children myself, I hadn't fully understood how much effort he put into raising us. Now, I'll devote myself to Mom and his place. A few hours later, Susan chased after me to our family home. She pleaded for forgiveness through the intercom. Please reconsider the divorce. I'll change my ways. On the intercom screen, I saw Susan desperately knocking on the front door. Shouldn't you let her in? I don't know the details, but Susan must have had her reasons. But I firmly told her through the intercom. I'll send the divorce papers later. Sign them and be happy with the store manager. I told my mother about Susan's affair and how she enjoyed a trip with her lover during her parents' funeral. Hearing this, my mother was appalled and declared she'd never speak to Susan again. Thus, Susan and I decided to divorce. I demanded alimony from Susan and her lover, Kevin. I heard Kevin's wife also demanded alimony from Susan. Despite their debts, Susan and Kevin promised to pay. Susan agreed to the divorce quickly, thinking she could remarry Kevin. But neither Kevin nor his wife planned to divorce. With 2 growing children, they decided to work on rebuilding their marriage. Susan might have thought she found true love with Kevin instead of me, but that was a big mistake. Perhaps in the extraordinary setting of our travels, we looked at each other through a filter that made everything seem special. Now that I'm calm, I'm amazed at my foolishness for finding her attractive. We've canceled the lease on the apartment we lived in together, so Susan has lost her place. Even if she wanted to return to her hometown in Montana, her sister Linda would never forgive her. The fact that Susan was out having fun while unreachable during her parents' passing would quickly spread in a small town. How could she face returning there after such an embarrassing act? Once things settled, Linda even came to my family home to offer her condolences. I really appreciate your help with the funeral. Without you, Mark, we couldn't have had a proper service. I just did what I should as a son-in-law. By the way, how is Susan? I imagine it's tough for her, having to pay alimony to me and her affair partner's wife. After what she did, you know, in a small town, word spreads fast. The company she worked for before meeting you isn't willing to rehire her, so she's struggling. I see. I have no feelings left for Susan, but I'm curious how she's managing. She always dreamed of city life. After getting married to you and living in the city, it must be hard for her to live in a small town with everyone watching, but you reap what you sow. I heard that all the inheritance left by their parents went to Linda. Because of the disgrace Susan brought to the family name, she had to sign papers relinquishing her inheritance rights. I don't think my parents forgive Susan. They might have overlooked her absence at the funeral, but when I think of the trouble she caused you, I'm sure our parents are weeping in the hereafter. Susan couldn't have her relatives pay the alimony for her and had no one else to turn to. Looking back, maybe the days she lived with me were the happiest in her life. She got to live her dream in the city, spending her earnings freely and enjoying her fair trips. I heard she's now living in a modest apartment without a bath near the area we used to live. Recently, I ran into Emily, the neighbor who informed me of Susan's affair, at a shopping mall. She told me she had seen a changed Susan. Working day and night to pay the alimony, she's become quite thin. She was cleaning the restrooms in a building. I felt a bit guilty seeing her like that. Strangely, I didn't feel sorry for her, nor did I think of myself as particularly cold-hearted. I've moved on, thinking about the next chapter in my life. So, I've started living with my mother. She was down after losing my father, but she's been getting better lately. She participates in senior activities in the neighborhood, enjoying yoga and chess. I live quite freely too, And recently I've started enjoying solo trips again. But I'm cautious about women I meet while traveling. With Susan's example, even if I find a good connection, I remember it's through the filter of the extraordinary. One day, 2 years later, I attended my middle school reunion. There, I hit it off with a classmate who had just divorced her husband. We go out for drinks twice a week, and I'm thinking of inviting her on a day trip.